For thousands of years, Egyptian mythology was dismissed as pure fantasy, tales of gods with animal heads, magic rituals, and impossible supernatural powers. Most people assumed ancient Egyptians simply invented these stories to entertain themselves or explain the world around them. But as archaeologists and historians started digging deeper, they discovered something that changed everything. Many of these myths weren't fantasy at all. They were ancient Egyptians describing real things they saw, real animals they encountered, and real natural phenomena they didn't understand. Let's explore the myths that archaeologists discovered actually had basis in reality. The jackal-headed Anubis. In Egyptian mythology, Anubis was the god of mummification and the afterlife, depicted with a human body and the head of a jackal. For centuries, historians assumed this was pure symbolism, a metaphor for death and the underworld. But the connection runs far deeper than that. Ancient Egyptians actually encountered jackals regularly around burial sites and graveyards. These scavengers were attracted to the bodies of the dead, especially in the open desert where early burials took place. When Egyptians began leaving their dead in shallow graves, jackals would dig up the bodies at night to feed on them. This was a genuine problem for grieving families who wanted to honor their deceased. Over time, they developed more sophisticated burial methods to prevent this desecration, eventually leading to mummification. But the image of the jackal as the guardian of the dead wasn't a coincidence. It came from the reality that jackals were the first creatures to encounter the body after death. Ancient Egyptians didn't see the jackal as a threat to honor the dead. They saw it as an intermediary, a creature that existed between the living world and whatever came next. Anubis became the protector of that transition. The god with the jackal's head was born from real experience, not imagination. The sacred ibis. Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, was depicted with the head of an ibis, a long-necked wading bird with a curved beak. Once again, historians thought this was symbolic. The ibis didn't have anything to do with writing or wisdom. But when archaeologists studied the ecology of ancient Egypt, they found something remarkable. The Nile River's flooding cycle was one of the most important events in Egyptian civilization. When the river flooded, it brought nutrient-rich silt that made the land fertile for crops. Without this annual flooding, Egypt would be uninhabitable desert. The ancient Egyptians needed to predict when this flooding would occur so they could prepare their fields and irrigation systems. And here's the key. Ibis birds arrived in Egypt in massive flocks at almost exactly the same time the Nile was about to flood. These birds were natural indicators of the flood season. Ancient Egyptians observed this pattern generation after generation, year after year. The ibis became associated with the annual cycle of life, death, and rebirth, the same cycle that the flood represented. Over time, the ibis became connected to Thoth, the god who recorded time itself, who tracked the cycles and seasons. The bird wasn't chosen randomly. It was chosen because it was literally the animal that announced when time itself would change. The ibis was a living calendar written by nature. The wings of Horus. Horus, the falcon-headed god of the sky, was one of the most important deities in the Egyptian pantheon. The falcon's wings became symbolic of the sky itself, of flight, of divine perspective. But this wasn't pure metaphor either. Falcons are incredibly fast and can see with exceptional clarity. They soar higher than almost any other bird in the Egyptian sky. For ancient Egyptians who had no airplanes, no way to see the world from above, the falcon represented the closest thing to that perspective. When you're on the ground in a vast desert, your view is limited. But when you watch a falcon climb higher and higher into the sky, you're watching something transcend human limitations. It's watching an animal access a view of the world that humans cannot. Over time, this translated into the falcon becoming the god of higher knowledge, of divine sight, the eye that sees all. Horus's eye became one of the most powerful symbols in Egypt, the Wedjat eye, representing wholeness, healing, and complete vision. The falcon didn't become a god because Egyptians made a random choice. It became a god because it was the animal that possessed the very quality they were trying to represent, the divine serpent. The serpent, particularly the cobra, was one of the most sacred symbols in Egypt. It appears throughout Egyptian religion, from the protective serpent guarding pharaohs to the serpent of chaos. For a long time, historians interpreted serpent symbolism as spiritual or abstract. But ancient Egypt was filled with deadly snakes. The cobra wasn't just a random symbol. It was a genuine threat that Egyptians encountered regularly. And more than that, cobras have a unique behavior that would have terrified and amazed ancient observers. When threatened, a cobra rears up and spreads its hood, expanding the skin around its neck. To To someone who's never seen this before, it looks like the snake is transforming itself, growing larger and more powerful right before your eyes. This behavior would have seemed supernatural to ancient Egyptians. A creature that was dangerous became suddenly more dangerous, expanding in size and presence as if channeling some divine power. The serpent's ability to shed its skin also contributed to its sacred status. The snake would disappear, seeming to die, and then reappear in a new form, completely renewed. This became associated with resurrection and rebirth, the cyclical nature of life and death. The cobra wasn't worshipped because Egyptians had good imagination. It was worshipped because it exhibited behavior that genuinely seemed impossible, magical, and divine. The cat goddess Batet. Batet, typically depicted as a cat or a woman with a cat's head, was the goddess of protection, fertility, and joy. Cats were so sacred in Egypt that killing one, even accidentally, could result in execution. This devotion seems extreme until you understand the practical reality of ancient Egypt. Egypt stored massive amounts of grain in warehouses to survive droughts and feed the population. These grain stores were constantly under attack from rats and mice that would destroy the food supply. Cats were the only effective way to control these rodent populations. Without cats protecting the grain, Egypt's civilization would have collapsed repeatedly from famine. Cats weren't sacred because Egyptians loved animals. They were sacred because cats literally meant the difference between survival and starvation. Every cat represented food security, economic stability, and the continuation of the civilization itself. Batet became a goddess not through mythology, but through necessity. She was the protection that kept the kingdom alive. The phoenix and the bennu. The bennu bird, the Egyptian version of the phoenix, was said to live for centuries before burning in flames and being reborn from the ashes. This myth has inspired stories across cultures, but it originated in Egypt because of a specific bird that Egyptians actually encountered. The bennu was based on the gray heron, a bird that was associated with creation and resurrection in Egyptian mythology. These birds have a remarkable ability. They return to the exact same nesting locations year after year, even after long absences. To ancient Egyptians watching herons, it would seem like the same bird was returning again and again, never aging, never dying, only disappearing for a season and returning renewed. This cyclical return, combined with the bird's elegant appearance and the way it stood at the edge of water and sky, made it seem like a divine messenger. The rebirth of the bennu wasn't about literal fire. It was about the cyclical return of a creature that seemed to exist outside of normal time. To ancient observers, that looked like immortality. The scales of Ma'at. One of the most important concepts in Egyptian religion was Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. In the afterlife, the deceased's heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was heavy with sin, the person would not be allowed to enter the afterlife. This sounds like pure spiritual symbolism until you understand what ancient Egyptians actually knew about balance and measurement. The Egyptians were masters of mathematics and engineering. They built pyramids with mathematical precision. They developed sophisticated systems of measurement and balance. The idea of weighing something to determine its truth or worth wasn't metaphorical for them, it was practical. A merchant in ancient Egypt would weigh goods on scales to ensure fair trade. An architect would balance measurements to ensure structures didn't collapse. In their world, balance and measurement were the keys to creating order out of chaos. The scales of Ma'at represented this real practice elevated to divine principle. The goddess wasn't arbitrary. She represented a system of thought that ancient Egyptians had developed through practical experience. That order comes from accurate measurement, that truth can be weighed and determined, that justice requires balance. What seems like mysticism was actually the application of the most advanced technology ancient Egyptians possessed: the scarab and transformation. The scarab beetle was one of the most important symbols in Egypt, representing transformation, rebirth, and the sun itself. For decades, historians wondered why Egyptians became so obsessed with an insect. But the answer comes from observing what scarab beetles actually do. Scarab beetles lay their eggs in animal dung, which they roll into perfect spheres. These spheres look exactly like balls of the sun. The beetles then bury these spheres and walk away. Weeks or months later, the eggs hatch and new beetles emerge from the ground as if born from the earth itself. To ancient Egyptians, this would have seemed like pure magic. A small creature rolling the sun across the earth, burying it, and then causing new creatures to emerge from the ground. This literally describes the life cycle of a scarab, but to observers who didn't understand insect development, it looked like transformation, resurrection, and cosmic power. The scarab didn't become important because Egyptians were imaginative. It became important because Egyptians were observant. They watched these beetles and saw what looked like a god in miniature, controlling the very forces they depended on. The river Nile as a god. Hapi, the god of the Nile flooding, was one of the oldest and most important deities in Egypt. The god was depicted as a man with a large belly, breasts, and a beard, sometimes with water plants growing from his body. He represented fertility, abundance, and the life-giving power of the annual flood. This wasn't mythology. This was Egypt's attempt to personify the most important force in their civilization. The Nile River wasn't just water. It was the difference between habitable land and desert. The annual flood cycle that Hapi represented was literally the foundation of Egyptian survival. When the Nile flooded at the right time and to the right degree, Egypt thrived. When it didn't, people starved. Worshipping Hapi wasn't superstition. It was the way ancient Egyptians expressed their dependence on and respect for the natural force that controlled their existence. They didn't pray to Hapi to change the flood. They prayed to understand it, prepare for it, and survive it. The god was their way of acknowledging a power greater than themselves. The devouring monster Ammit. Ammit was depicted as a creature with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. This monstrosity would devour the hearts of those judged unworthy in the afterlife. It sounds like pure fantasy. Why would you combine three animals that don't naturally go together? But the answer is actually quite logical. All three of these animals were the most dangerous predators in ancient Egypt. The crocodile lurked in the Nile, killing people without warning. The lion was a powerful predator that hunted across the savannah. The hippopotamus, despite seeming docile, was responsible for more human deaths in Africa than almost any other animal. By combining all three, Egyptians created a symbol of absolute danger. Ammit represented the ultimate threat. Every predator they feared concentrated into one being. The creature wasn't random. It was a psychological representation of the dangers that surrounded them, combined into a single image that embodied all threats at once. The winged disc. The winged disc, or sun disk with wings, was a constant symbol in Egyptian art and religion. It appears on temples, tombs, and religious objects throughout Egypt. It represented the sun traveling across the sky, gaining power and invulnerability as it moved. This symbol didn't come from nothing. Egyptians observed birds flying across the sky during the day. Birds were creatures that could achieve something humans couldn't. They could fly toward the sun. To ancient Egyptians, this seemed like flight toward the divine, like an attempt to reach the ultimate source of power. The scarab rolling the sun and the falcon flying toward it both represented the same concept. Creatures that could interact with the sun in ways humans could not. The winged disc combined both ideas, giving the sun itself the wings of a bird, allowing it to traverse the sky with the power and grace of an animal. What seemed like abstract religious symbolism was actually ancient Egyptians attempting to describe the natural world using the only framework they had, the behavior of animals they observed. The eternal cycle. What emerges from all of these myths is a pattern. Egyptian mythology wasn't a collection of random fantasies. It was ancient Egyptians attempting to understand the forces that controlled their lives by connecting them to observable reality. They saw patterns in nature. They observed animals and natural phenomena. They created gods and myths as a way of processing and preserving that knowledge. The jackal taught them about death and decomposition. The ibis taught them about cyclical time. The falcon taught them about perspective. The cobra taught them about transformation and danger. The cat taught them about survival. The beetle taught them about resurrection. The Nile taught them about dependence on forces greater than themselves. These weren't mistakes or wild imagination. They were sophisticated observations of the natural world, filtered through the cultural and spiritual frameworks available to them. When archaeologists and historians stopped dismissing Egyptian mythology as fantasy and started looking for the real basis behind these stories, they discovered that ancient Egyptians were far more observant and logical than previously believed. They weren't inventing gods out of nothing. They were attempting to encode real knowledge into immortal stories. They were creating a system to preserve their understanding of the world for future generations. They were succeeding. That's why, thousands of years later, we can still look at these myths and, if we look closely enough, see the reality beneath the symbols. The Egyptian gods weren't supernatural beings. They were ancient Egyptians' way of saying, we see the patterns in nature. We understand our dependence on these patterns. And we will remember them forever.